For this episode of The Contrarian, or Against the Grain YouTube channel, we're going to focus on Ferdinand Marcos Jr., also known as BBM. Going against the grain, we're going to ask, will BBM be the greatest Philippine president ever? There's no shortage of Philippine presidents that have been dubbed, quote, the best ever, unquote. Even the mediocre at best, Noynoy Aquino, was dubbed, quote, the best president ever by many on social media after he passed away. Before he is even elected, many supporters of Bongbong Marcos say that he is going to be the greatest president the Philippines will ever have. Is this just hype? Or do they know something that we don't? Does BBM have what it takes to achieve GOAT status? GOAT, of course, means greatest of all time. It doesn't really matter whether you are a fan or a critic or somewhere in between. This channel doesn't take any sides, but we are going to explore whether there is some possibility of truth to that claim. The truth is, even if all the negative things people are saying about BBM are true, these alleged weaknesses might actually work in his favor if the right circumstances are present. I know that's shocking. A lot of people would probably stop this video at this point. I would understand, but hear me out. Please understand this basic truth of history. Destiny doesn't always call the equipped, but oftentimes destiny equips whom it calls. In many cases, it is the circumstances that historical figures find themselves in that draw out their greatness. They come in very weak, very mediocre, with all sorts of baggage and counterproductive personality traits. But times test them and bring out their inner strength, tenacity, and will. They emerge from these trials heroes. Can this also apply to Marcos Jr.? If we assume that a lot of the criticisms against Marcos Jr. are absolutely true, is there any room for greatness? Is there a possibility that this very flawed political personality would actually turn out to be a very good president? Even GOAT material. I would submit that in certain circumstances, and if certain policies are pursued, and also if certain things line up, he has more than what he needs to be the president. Not just the president that we deserve, but the president that we've been looking for. I say this not because I'm some sort of hardcore Marcos loyalist or holdover Duterte fanatic looking forward to a Duterte 2.0. Nor do I say this because I am disenchanted with the Leni Robredo crowd. No, I do this as an analyst and an objective student of history. I'm going to itemize every character charge made against Marcos Jr. and explain why such a character flaw can actually lead to greatness. Charge number 1, BBM has a weak character. No less than President Rodrigo Roa Duterte said BBM is weak, and weak over several press briefings. Let's assume that President Rodrigo Roa Duterte is an excellent judge of character. After all, with several billion pesos in intelligence funds, you would think that the man, a seasoned politician himself, would know what he's talking about. Let's accept that charge for argument's purposes. For the sake of argument, let us agree that BBM is weak. Now what? I would suggest that a lot of the reasons why the Philippines and similar countries are so poor is because our presidents have been too strong. They step into the economy, they interfere with market forces, and the results, unfortunately, since the late 1960s, have been too predictable. From President Garcia's Filipino first policies to Diosdado Macapagal's import substitution schemes, the Philippines has steadily degraded from being the pearl of the Orient Seas to the impoverished country that so many Filipinos want to emigrate from. Presidential programs and initiatives like Filipino First import substitution, and the late 1950s Retail Nationalization Act did more harm than good. That's right, they did more harm than good. Filipino First discouraged foreign ownership and investment in Filipino companies. The Retail Nationalization Act sought to cut down Chinese domination of sari-sari stores. Import substitution schemes raised tariffs on imported manufactured goods so expensive and locally manufactured goods can look more affordable. What did all these presidential policies lead to? They led to fewer jobs, higher prices, lousy products and services, and degradation of Filipino living standards. Sure, we got our Filipino pride, and we entertained a sense of Filipino nationalism, but we didn't get much else. No wonder, starting in the mid-1960s, Filipinos started migrating out of the country in droves, first to the United States, then to the rest of the world. This is the sad legacy of government intervention in the economy, all led by a strong president. How would BBM's personal weakness help turn things around? According to historian Ambet Ocampo, a retrieved Marcos diary passage indicated that Marcos Sr. was worried about BBM being, quote, too carefree and lazy, end quote. Will a weak and lazy BBM actually help the Philippine economy? Instead of a strong presidency that insists on that the government always butt into the economy, maybe a BBM who has grown up in the lap of luxury would see that leaving the economic situation to adjust to market forces would lead to a better approach. Maybe he would leave things alone. Even though he didn't finish, BBM still went to the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Business, the top business school on the planet. And I'm hoping that he picked up some basic economic principles from that school. Basic ideas like free markets, lower taxes, and less regulation help improve economic activity. A weak BBM would not insist on even more protectionist legislation from Congress and take a more hands-off approach when it comes to the economy. Maybe in this context, the character weakness of a carefree and lazy BBM who has a soft political will might actually work to the benefit of the Filipino people. Instead of following in the long line of Pinoy presidents who seek to, quote, regulate and, quote, correct the market, we finally have a president who will take a hands-off approach and possibly signal to the rest of the bureaucracy that maybe the Philippine government has interfered too much already. Maybe BBM would say that it's time to take a more relaxed view on regulation. What will happen if BBM takes such a, quote, lazy, end quote, approach? Take a wild guess. You don't have to look far. During the Trump administration in the United States, Trump came up with this new rule. For every one new regulation the federal government is going to impose, it has to cut 2 existing regulations. What do you think happened? That's right, the economy boomed. Not only did he cut back regulations, he also reduced taxes. There were more jobs than job seekers, and I'm talking about real jobs and wage growth, all thanks to an increase in economic activity, all pumped up by business spending. A weak and quote-unquote lazy BBM could also have this impact on the Philippine economy. By simply letting the government get out of the way of the economy, long frustrated and suppressed business forces could flourish. Less taxes and government controls lead to more business formation. More businesses forming mean more employment for Pinoys. More businesses competing over a fixed pool of labor means higher wages. Higher wages means more spending power for Pinoys. More spending power means more business opportunities. More business opportunities mean more business. And on it goes, more for everyone. A rising tide lifts all boats. Charge number 2. Marcos Jr. doesn't show up. Another claimed weakness of BBM made by no less than Lenny Robredo is that he doesn't show up. This much is true. Except for the SMNI debate, Marcos Jr. hasn't shown up for any Comelec-sponsored debate or CNN debate. He also doesn't show up for interviews with media personalities that he thinks might be adversarial to him, like Jessica Soho. Is this a fatal weakness? How can this supposed glaring personal flaw benefit the Filipino people? Well, it would benefit us the same way as charge number 1 would. Fear of confrontation means BBM doesn't have the political will to impose his mandate, whatever it may be, on the economy. When you have a president who doesn't show up, you probably would have less of a need to change existing laws and regulations. This can translate to less interference with the economy. BBM is more likely to let things run as they are. This is good news, believe it or not. Why? During the final months of the Duterte administration, several key economic laws have been passed that seek to reform the way we do business as a country. We're talking about changing the definition of public utilities so that current law allows for full foreign ownership of certain types of transport, tollways, and other key businesses. Recently, there was also a modernization of the retail system. It is now easier for foreigners to set up retail businesses in the Philippines. Also, a few years back, President Duterte pushed for tax reform. So if you make less than 20,000 pesos a month, you don't have to pay any taxes. What does this all mean? This means that there can now be a robust investment climate in the Philippines, all thanks to a friendlier attitude towards foreign direct investment. If there are more foreign investors in the Philippines, this means more businesses will translate to more jobs. When there are more jobs, there is more pressure to raise wages. When more Pinoys are making more money, they have better spending power. Instead of spending it all on food or a limited amount of goods and services, they'll be spending a lot more on luxuries and wants. This, of course, means greater business opportunities, which in turn attracts even more foreign investment, and on it goes. This is not rocket science, folks. This is how Singapore and Hong Kong became rich. If they could do it, why can't we? Unfortunately, since the 1960s, Filipinos have been going in the other direction. We believed in economic nationalism or Philippines for Filipinos, and where did it get us? When we have a president that doesn't show up and doesn't like confrontation, given the economic foundations that President Duterte has laid down, a non-confrontational or even a lazy president might actually be good news. Compare this with a Lenny presidency. Lenny Robredo is in the mode of Noynoy Aquino and Cory Aquino. What did they do when they got power? That's right, they reviewed all the policies of the previous administration, and in many cases, they reversed key policies. They reversed hundreds of millions of pesos worth of contracts entered into by the previous government. In fact, in the case of Noynoy, the Philippine government had to pay hefty fines, but they didn't care. That is not what we need to do now. Why? If we want people to invest in our country, those foreign investors in China, Europe, or wherever else they may be, want some sort of assurance that we're not going to change the rules midway. If we have a president that's too lazy to show up or doesn't like confrontation, chances are he would leave things as they are. Guess what? That's great news. Charge number 3. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has tax issues. Marcos Jr. didn't file his income tax returns for 4 years in the 1980s. On top of that, his family is liable for up to 203 billion pesos in estate taxes. The Philippine Supreme Court released a final and executory judgment on the Marcos family's estate tax liability way back in 1997. I would submit that BBM's tax issues uniquely qualify him to be a great president when it comes to tax policy. In the Philippines, many people believe that high taxes are a good thing. Too many believe that the higher the tax rates, the higher the chance that those with money will cough up the cash so the rest of society will benefit. This would mean more hospitals, more social services, better schools, you name it. If only that were true. According to research studies during the high tax period of the United States in the 1950s all the way to the early 60s, it turns out that the higher the tax rate, the lower the tax revenue. Imagine that. Only when presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan cut the tax rate, that overall tax revenues increased. Viewed from that perspective, high taxes don't work. Rich people have accountants and lawyers to advise them on how to structure their businesses, as well as their corporations, in such a way that they pay as little taxes as possible. Who do you think gets left with the empty bag? That's right, ordinary Filipinos like you. In fact, it's the middle class that bears the disproportionate tax burden in the Philippines. This is why the CREATE Act as well as the TRAIN Act passed by the Duterte administration were such welcome pieces of legislation. By reducing taxes, these laws increased economic volume and incentivized entrepreneurs to reinvest in their businesses. What do you think happens when businesses invest in growth? It means more hiring, which can lead to wage competition and higher wages for Filipinos. It can start an upward spiral of better and better economic prospects for the country as a whole. And it's all due to the fact that instead of wasting all that money in the form of taxes, it is reinvested or it is taken out and spent. Whatever the case may be, it benefits the economy instead of getting sucked up by the government and wasted on bureaucracy. The truth, lower tax rates increase overall tax revenue. Instead of wasting all this money on tax lawyers and accountants to try to beat taxes, big business people and huge corporations would rather just pay a lower rate and be done with it. Since Marcos has all these tax issues, he is uniquely positioned to understand just how burdensome and outright oppressive the tax system could be. It wouldn't be a shock to see him have a very lenient attitude towards tax collection and the tax rate by extension. It also wouldn't be a shock if he would support legislation pushed by Congress or the Senate to lower taxes or otherwise streamline revenue collection through lower rates and less penalties. Any of these would benefit the economy because it would jumpstart capital formation. Taxes are not meant to build. Instead, they are the fine people have to pay for being successful. Perhaps with this experience with the tax code, BBM would be more than understanding when it comes to tax reform and figuring out the proper tax level so that the rest of the economy can improve. This will help BBM become a transformative president when it comes to the Philippine economy. Charge number 4. Marcos Jr. is a liar. One of the most repeated charges against the Marcos family is that they're liars. Take the case of President Marcos Sr. He claimed to be a war hero with many medals. His critics say that those medals were fake and he was never a hero. Likewise with BBM. On his official web page during his Senate years, he claimed that he graduated from Oxford University. It turns out that he got a special diploma instead of a regular one. Even more peculiar, that program has actually been abolished. Honesty issues also hound his sister, Amy. She made claims regarding her academic record at UP, and her critics were saying that those are all fake as well. Again and again, the Marcos family members are called liars. Generally speaking, if someone calls you a liar, it's bad news. It puts your character in a bad light and it shows that you are untrustworthy. But I would submit in the topsy-turvy and highly unpredictable world of Filipino politics, being a liar is not necessarily a liability. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating that people lie and not keep their word or just be completely dishonest with each other. All that I'm saying is that when you are in certain circumstances, and Filipino politics is definitely one of those circumstances, being able to refuse to honor your word or to flip-flop or find some sort of opening or wiggle room to turn your back on earlier promises is not necessarily a liability. In fact, it can be an asset. For Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to be elected, he has to get the favor of many different factions in the Philippines. From all the news reports, it seems that he has been building a coalition of distinct power blocks, from provincial politicians to ex-President GMA to the military and police to outgoing President Duterte's allies. BBM has been racking up key political alliances to ensure his victory. The most significant among these is his uni team alliance with Sara Duterte and families like the Estradas, Arroyos, the Garcias of Cebu, and others. What happens when it comes time for these different political factions, who don't always see eye to eye, mind you, try to get a political payback from Marcos Jr.? Well, they wouldn't expect much. At least they shouldn't. Why? They would be trying to get a liar to honor his word. That's right. They would be trying to get a liar, quote unquote, to honor his word. They, of course, know better. Say what you will about the Marcos brand, but the idea of being betrayed and being let down is easily baked into that brand. I would argue that this does not count against Marcos. Instead, it counts for him. Because coming in, these people would know that not all promises and not all expectations are going to be met. There are only a fixed number of administration appointment slots that can be filled. There's only so much political capital that can be allocated to BBM's power blocks. So they have to be patient. They have to be satisfied with whatever Marcos gives them. This is crucial because any government composed of dissatisfied power blocks with unmet yet unrealistic demands can easily lead to a mutiny or even a coup. Well, BBM power blocks cannot claim to have been deceived. They cannot claim to have been backstabbed or dealt with unfairly because they're dealing with a man who comes from a family who has the reputation, whether justly acquired or not, of being liars and untrustworthy. Put simply, if you know coming in that the person you're dealing with may turn against you and may not honor their word, then you will be a fool for trying to make them keep their word. These power blocks, individuals, and parties come from very powerful factions of Filipino society. They are not virgins in the political sphere. No, not by a long shot. They know how the game works. Since they know that the reputation of Marcos and his family is not that of people who will always deliver on their word, then they would be perfectly okay, or at least they're more likely to be okay, with whatever they get. This, in turn, reduces the chance of power fracturing after a Marcos presidency, because everybody knows that all the promises will not be fulfilled and all the political capital and favors will not be repaid. And that's perfectly okay because they know who they're dealing with. How can this benefit the Filipino people? It translates to stability and less corruption. Charge number 5. I know that's a big claim to make, but bear with me. Charge number 5. The Marcoses cannot be trusted. Given the context I've fleshed out in the previous charge, being called a thief or a fraud actually works in BBM's favor. Why? People know where they stand when it comes time to collect political capital and favors. After all, peace, harmony, and unity within the ruling administration are crucial for the next 6 years if Marcos wants to stay in power. And since everybody knows that he cannot be relied on to fulfill all his promises, they are forced to be contented with whatever they get. This can lead to, believe it or not, less corruption. You see, corruption in the Philippine bureaucracy happens when there are overlapping jurisdictions and fiefdoms. Appointed power block members aren't really quite sure where they stand. Their authority is vaguely defined. So what they would do is they would assign people to other parts of the bureaucracy, and everybody will try to collect money, justly or unjustly, based on where they are in the bureaucracy. All this, of course, is an attempt to siphon off their political patrons. That's how it worked ever since Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was toppled. To paraphrase one local Roman Catholic Church official on EDSA's aftermath, during Marcos' time, you had Alibaba and the 40 thieves, but only Alibaba stole. After EDSA, everybody was a thief. It seems like every government agency, all the way to the local barangay, everybody was stealing. Believe it or not, since Marcos has this reputation of being a liar and an unreliable person when it comes to political capital, there is tremendous pressure within the ruling coalition to solidify their lines of authority. They're looking for clearly defined lines of what people can do and where they can do it. This leads, believe it or not, to less corruption. Since your patron is right on top of you, you're not going to be pushing people below you to places they have no right to be. There is less overlap. Because they're not pushing you to overlap with somebody else or assigning you to steal from someone else in the government. You're going to make them look bad if you steal too much. Nobody in their right mind is saying that the BBM presidency would somehow be miraculously free of graft and corruption. I wouldn't go that far. After all, no Pinoy administration has ever escaped charges of corruption, mismanagement, or waste. But you'd be surprised. This so-called weakness of being untrustworthy and morally corrupt could actually work in his favor due to the peculiar power dynamics described above in Philippine politics. Charge number 6, BBM uses or used cocaine. President Rodrigo Roa Duterte made a blind item accusation that one of the 2022 presidential contenders used or uses cocaine. He didn't specifically name Marcos Jr., but this allegation unleashed a flurry of speculation centering on BBM. For the purpose of this video's analysis on a potential BBM presidency, let's assume the charges are true. If it's true that Marcos Jr. has tried drugs in the past, this can actually help him become a better president. You have to understand that drug addiction is more of a disease than a crime issue. Just because somebody became an addict doesn't mean they're no longer a member of the human species. Just because someone did drugs in the past doesn't mean they are forever addicts. Even if a person is an addict, that doesn't mean he or she cannot drop their habit. People can and do change. Whatever you may believe about drug addiction, your beliefs definitely don't mean that you can pull a trigger and kill that person with impunity because they're no longer part of the same species as you. They still have the same rights as you because their blood bleeds as red as yours. Believe it or not, they are still made in the image of God, just as you are. And it's only when somebody who has either been accused of doing drugs or has done drugs in the past can see the situation that they are in a position where they can see themselves in the people being hunted down, bullied, and maligned by society. These are addicts and outcasts. This unique perspective can help President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. craft a more humane drug policy. In fact, in at least one interview, he has said that he will continue the war on drugs, but it will be more humane, with a focus on its health dimension. A rational interpretation of such a statement or policy direction indicates that much of the government policy during a BBM administration, when it comes to drugs, will focus on rehabilitation. This would be a welcome change. But it also doesn't mean that crimes caused by addicts will be now conveniently swept under the rug. It is precisely these heinous crimes caused by addicts and the menace that they cause that made President Duterte such a hero, whether you like it or not. Leni Robredo, of all people, actually let go of a tremendous opportunity when she talked about the Portugal Protocol. People who are looking for an alternative to the Duterte drug war saw a bright light of hope when Leni Robredo talked about the Portugal Protocol. For those that don't know, Portugal in Europe used to have one of the highest drug overdoses, drug crimes, and social ills arising out of drugs. It was really bad. Several years back, Portugal changed the rules. Instead of automatically arresting people for possession of drugs, they were diverted to treatment programs. In essence, Portugal decriminalized all drugs. While it's still against the law if you have a large amount of dope on you or it's obvious that you're going to distribute it, if you get picked up by the cops and you have a small amount, the law pushed you towards rehabilitation. What have been the results? AIDS transmission by IV drug users has gone down a lot. Drug crimes overall have gone down, and drug addiction rates have fallen quite a bit. In other words, when people who found themselves in the unhappy situation of drug addiction are afforded a little bit of understanding, compassion, and assistance, things become possible again. BBM might lead us to that alternative path. BBM, will he be the GOAT president of the Philippines? For the foregoing reasons, I would suggest that the criticisms against Marcos Jr. don't automatically position him to be the worst president. Nor would such claimed personal weaknesses necessarily lead the Philippines to a second declaration of martial law and a new dark age. Nope. If anything, the claimed character weaknesses against him, assuming that they are true, can actually work in his favor. The truth is, free markets, less government intervention, and lower taxes work. This video is less about supporting Marcos, which is not my intention, but to wake Pinoys up to the importance of smaller government policies, which can lead to greater prosperity and freedom for all.